Hey, in this short lecture, we'll begin looking at close relationships. So, I want to begin by talking a little bit about the importance of close relationships, why they matter. And perhaps some of the most convincing evidence comes from researchers who spoke to people who are dying in hospices and asked them what mattered most to them, right? Like what mattered most in life. And 90% put intimate relationships at the top of the list. Now, I should mention that intimate relationships, so often we hear the term intimate and we think about sex, but that's not the case here, right? So intimate relationships mean close relationships, family relationships, close friends, and the like. And so we see that there's a correlation, right, between close relationships and people's happiness. People who maintain a lot of close relationships generally report a lot of satisfaction with their lives as well as emotional well-being, regardless of which culture they come from and regardless of how old they are, right? So, it's interesting. I've read a number of these kinds of late life studies, and no one says that they wish they spent more time at work. So that's something to think about as you move towards your careers. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of intimacy and see what we mean by it. So according to your book, intimacy is a state of close union, contact, association, or acquaintance. And of course, this can occur across a variety of relationships. So for college students like yourselves, we see that people report these kinds of close relationships across a variety of categories, right? So 47% cite romantic partnerships, 36% friendships, and 14% family members. So you see, right? This isn't a boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife kind of thing necessarily. This intimacy is really just about sharing contact and communication, right? Close communication with another human being. So there are some elements, right, or dimensions of intimacy that are worth mentioning. And of course, one of them is physical intimacy, right? Now, with physical intimacy, we know that this occurs even before birth. And you might ask yourself, well, how does this happen? The answer is that you're carried around by your mother. You're literally inside another person for 9 months before you're born. And then, of course, this continues on during early childhood. If you've been around babies or if you've had any kids of your own, you know that kids really, really seek out intimacy, right? They cry, you pick them up, they stop crying, right? So all through infancy and early childhood, you're being rocked, you're being fed, you're being held by your parents. But over time, of course, this intimacy kind of lessens as we age. We become more and more independent and less dependent on this kind of physical intimacy. Indeed, at points we swap this kind of intimacy for sexual intimacy, right? Now, it's important to realize that not all physical intimacy is sexual. There's hugging, there's touching, there's all the kinds of things we talked about earlier. And we also have to understand that sexual intimacy doesn't necessarily lead to more of a connection, right? Interestingly, we find that more than half of sexually active teens had partners that they weren't dating and had no desire to begin dating. So that one metric shows us that the sexual intimacy does not necessarily correlate to emotional intimacy and that kind of emotional closeness that one might suppose. Another category of intimacy is intellectual intimacy, and this is based on relationships where you're able to exchange thoughts, talk about ideas, right? There's also emotional intimacy where you share feelings and or personal information with another person. And then we can establish intimacy too through shared activities, so it's just spending time together. We know that when people spend time together for a prolonged amount of time, that they develop sort of unique ways of relating, right? So ways that they communicate and ways that they understand each other that are really unique to just that particular relationship. And oftentimes, this can change a relationship from impersonal to interpersonal, right? We talked about that difference in the first chapter. Now, there are a bunch of outside forces that can help create this kind of intimacy. One of them is enduring physical challenges, right? So, the armed forces know this. I mean, that's why, for example, if you join the Marines and you go to Paris Island, they put you through a lot of physical challenges. And one of the things that does is it makes you much closer to the people that are enduring them with you, right? It creates a sense of camaraderie, a sense of friendship, and establishes personal connections. The fraternity and sorority hazing operates under the same sort of cognitive map, right? The same sort of plan. So the idea is that they put you through hell during Hell Week, and you get closer with all your pledge mates, and then by the time you're done, you've established this unique interpersonal relationship with everyone. This kind of unique interpersonal relationship, of course, can also lead to things like private codes and kind of good-hearted teasing that occurs between people sometimes. So, for example, if I see one of my golf buddies, if I walk into the clubhouse and he's in there drinking, he might look at me and be like, "What's up with you, asshole?" Right? And when he does that, he's not really calling me an asshole. It's a form of friendship. It's a form of teasing. It's like it's just buddying around, for lack of a better term. But it's those kinds of relationships. And that kind of sharing and activities that you do with people that often is fostered and furthered by things like private codes and teasing. Now, we need to understand that not all relationships exhibit all four dimensions of intimacy. And not even the closest relationships will always function at the highest level of intimacy. Indeed, it goes through cycles, right? It waxes and wanes like the moon. So at points, especially if you're in a long-term relationship, you might find yourself feeling closer to that person at some points than others. You might feel more that you enjoy physical intimacy with the person more at certain points than others. You might feel like your relationship shifts more towards emotional intimacy and intellectual intimacy as time goes by, right? That's not at all uncommon. Either way, though, we know that fear of intimacy, which is something that many people possess, often leads to problems in both in forming relationships and in keeping them going. Now, there are, of course, differences, and we've talked about this all throughout the semester with all our chapters. There are differences between masculine and feminine intimacy styles. So with disclosure, for example, we know that women are more likely to share things about themselves than men, right? However, the differences really aren't as dramatic as we might think. Now, female-female relationships, so a woman talking to her girlfriend, for example, in that kind of situation, they're likely to disclose more than any other type of relationships, right? After that comes male-female. So that might be husband-wife, a girl and her good friend that's a man. Then male-male relationships have the least amount of disclosure, right? So when men are hanging out with each other, they're usually not sharing, a lot of important hidden things about themselves with each other. We know that at every age, women disclose more than men. And we know that the information that they disclose is generally more personal. So it's the kind of things that wouldn't normally be shared and are held as items of great import, right? Part of people's self-perception, right? These things that are being shared. Men oftentimes, by the way, express intimacy through shared activities and through doing things with others. So men might have a difficult time, for example, vocalizing or verbalizing the way that they feel about people. So as a result, instead of saying it, they might do things for another person. Like your boyfriend might have a hard time saying "I love you," and instead might fix your garbage disposal. That isn't at all uncommon as a pattern of behavior for men. Now, what we find is that gender roles are more important than biological sex in how we express intimacy. So you'll remember that gender is different than sex. So sex is what you got on you. Sex is whether or not you're a man or a woman. Gender, of course, has to do with things like masculinity and femininity, or the idea of what it means to be a woman, or what you should act like if you're a man, right? So what we find is that masculine men are the most likely to express intimacy through helping behaviors, fixing your garbage disposal, taking out your trash, and shared activities, doing things with you, doing things with their friends, playing in the softball league, being on the bowling team, right? More feminine men, however, are likely to express intimacy more directly, especially to other men. So if you're John Wayne, strong silent type, the man's man, so to speak, in the old perception of such things, you're more than likely to do things for other people. If you're more of a feminine man, if you possess more of the feminine characteristics, it's more likely that you'll just say it, right? Now, in terms of sex, right, women view sexual activity as an expression of intimacy, right? So women have sex out of intimacy, let's say, whereas men often view sexual activity as a ways to create intimacy, right? It's a way of building closeness. I tell you what, it's really strange to me sometimes that men and women ever got together, because we see things quite differently oftentimes. So we should talk a little bit, as we do in every chapter as well, about cultural influences on intimacy. So one of the things that's interesting is that what's been considered to be public and private kinds of behavior have really changed over time. So this, of course, affects what's said in disclosure, what disclosure consists of, right? At any given time, what might be considered private, what you keep to yourself, might change, right? So we know, for example, in the 16th century, newlyweds were expected to have sex on a bed being carried by a witness or witnesses, right? So obviously a very different sort of understanding of sexual amours, right? And what is considered to be private, right? So this sort of thing, again, changes over time. We also know that in collectivist cultures, so for example, many Eastern cultures, there are big differences in how people communicate with what they consider to be their in-groups and out-groups. So, for example, in collectivist cultures, people are generally more formal with one another, which is all about respect, right? It's all about yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, addressing people by their titles and so on. Oftentimes, people in these collectivist cultures won't speak to one another until they're introduced to one another, right? Because even speaking to someone says something about your level of respect for them, right? It implies a certain level of familiarity that might not be appropriate. We also find that many people in these collectivist cultures tend to hide unfavorable information about in-group members from out-group members. So what that means, if we unpack it a little bit, is, for example, if you are in a collectivist culture and a member of your family is addicted to drugs, or has trouble with alcohol, or is just wild sexually, right, or something of the sort, you're more likely to keep that from people outside your family, right, to keep that information under wraps. In individualistic cultures like the United States, Europe, Canada, there are fewer distinctions between personal relationships and casual ones. So as Americans, we are more willing to share certain things. If you doubt me, just go watch like Jerry Springer or Maury Povich, or even just see what people are posting on Twitter, right? We express all kinds of things that might be kept under wraps in collectivist cultures, and we do it fairly willingly. So, relational intimacy, that intimacy that you build up with people, may develop more quickly online. We've talked about that in our online chapter. And we know that mediated communication, emailing, texting, DMing, can be just as personal as face-to-face forms of communication, right? New technologies like texting, Facebook, all these enhance verbal, emotional, and social intimacy. But there's still problems, right? It's created new ways to be virtually unfaithful, for example. So cheating online, right, instead of in quote-unquote real life. And what's interesting is the studies show that people regard online cheating as badly, if not worse, than real cheating, which kind of blows my mind. But I was born well before the internet, so maybe there's a reason for that. We should also note that it's impossible to have intimate relationships with everyone you know. You might decide that you want to make it a goal to get as close to as many people as you can. But research shows us that we really want about 6 close, important relationships at any one time. If we have less than 4, it can make us feel socially deprived. More than 6 people leads to diminishing returns. So if you gun for 10 really close friends, it's not going to be, or 12 really close friends, it's not going to be twice as good as having 6, right? Because as we have more friends, we can't really engage as much with those people because we just don't have enough time. Indeed, we know that an obsession with intimacy ultimately, of course, can lead to less satisfying relationships. All right, that does it for this lecture. Next time we'll talk about communication in families. Thanks for checking this out.